Israel sent its most senior diplomat to Riyadh with a proposal it had never made to any Arab state before: full normalization, official embassies, open skies agreements, economic partnerships worth billions, a public handshake that would have been unthinkable 12 months earlier. Mohammed bin Salman looked at everything Israel was offering: the diplomatic recognition that every previous Saudi king had withheld, the regional legitimacy that no Arab normalization could fully replace, the American political reward that Israeli lobbying could deliver, and he said, "Not enough, bring me more." That moment, which leaked through 3 separate diplomatic channels before it was formally denied, was the moment the entire Middle East understood something it had not fully absorbed before. Israel, the most militarily powerful state in the region, was the supplicant, and MBS was the one setting the terms. How a Saudi crown prince turned the Abraham Accords framework into the most powerful piece of diplomatic leverage in the Middle East, made Israel compete for Saudi approval rather than the other way around, and extracted concessions from Washington and Jerusalem that no Arab leader had extracted in a generation. That is the story nobody told you clearly until now. What MBS inherited. Saudi Arabia's relationship with Israel was, for decades, defined by a single word: rejection. The Arab League's Khartoum Resolution of 1967 established the framework: no peace, no recognition, no negotiation. Saudi Arabia's public position remained locked inside that framework for over 50 years. But the private reality was entirely different. Saudi and Israeli intelligence services shared information on Iran. Saudi and Israeli military planners informally coordinated on regional threat assessments. The private relationship was real and substantive, but the public position remained frozen because Palestine was the one issue on which Arab public opinion remained sufficiently mobilized that visible accommodation of Israel carried genuine internal legitimacy risks. Every king before MBS accepted that constraint. MBS recognized something his predecessors had not fully acted on. Young Saudis, young Emiratis, young Bahrainis cared more about economic opportunity, entertainment, and the quality of their daily lives than about a conflict their grandparents had defined their identities around. The generational shift in Arab public opinion was real and measurable. A Saudi leader with enough domestic legitimacy, built through economic modernization, social reform, and the Vision 2030 narrative, could absorb the political cost of normalization with Israel if the terms were sufficiently advantageous. But MBS went further than simply calculating that normalization was now politically survivable. He recognized what Saudi normalization actually was: more valuable than any weapons contract, more valuable than any investment agreement. Saudi normalization with Israel was the one thing Israel wanted above everything else, the one thing America would pay almost any price to facilitate, and the one thing that could only come from Riyadh. The UAE had already normalized. Bahrain had normalized. Jordan and Egypt had long-standing peace treaties. Saudi Arabia was the last and the most important, the guardian of Mecca and Medina, the leader of the Arab world's dominant power. The country whose recognition would transform Israel from a tolerated presence in the region to a genuinely accepted member of the regional order. That recognition was a prize that only MBS could deliver. And MBS understood that you do not sell your most valuable asset at the first price offered. The Abraham Accords and the scarcity dynamic. The Abraham Accords of 2020, brokered by the Trump administration, brought the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco into normalization with Israel. They were celebrated as a transformation of the Middle East, and they were. But every analysis acknowledged one thing: it was a partial transformation. The full transformation required Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's absence from the Abraham Accords made everything the other normalizing states delivered incomplete. The scarcity of Saudi recognition increased as every other Arab normalizer moved without Riyadh. After 2020, everyone knew that, and MBS knew they knew it. The political rewards for joining in 2020 would have been real. American arms sales secured, diplomatic support consolidated, Khashoggi pressure further relieved. MBS allowed the other Gulf states to move while Riyadh held back. Critics interpreted this as hesitation. It was actually a sophisticated reading of the scarcity dynamic. If Saudi Arabia had normalized alongside the UAE and Bahrain, its normalization would have been one of several significant but not singular moves. By holding back, MBS ensured that Saudi normalization retained its status as the final and most important piece of a transformation that everyone acknowledged was incomplete without it. Saudi Arabia did not say it would never normalize. It said normalization was possible, but the price was significant. And then it began specifying that price in ways that escalated with every iteration. The geography of the negotiation had been completely inverted from everything that preceded it. The demands, public and private. The public demands were already significant. A Palestinian state, not a vague commitment to a two-state solution, but an actual specific pathway to statehood with defined borders and a defined timeline. A halt to Israeli settlement expansion in the West Bank. Palestinian civil authority over designated territories. These demands went far beyond what any previous Arab normalizing state had required. The UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco had all normalized without extracting concrete Israeli concessions on Palestine. Saudi Arabia said not on those terms. But the private demands were where the masterstroke fully revealed itself. Saudi Arabia wanted a mutual defense treaty with the United States, a formal treaty-level security guarantee equivalent to the Article 5 commitments that bind NATO members. Not the informal security relationship that had defined American protection of Saudi Arabia since 1945, but a binding legal commitment that would survive changes in American administration and provide ironclad guarantees against Iranian attack. For decades, Saudi Arabia had accepted informal American protection as sufficient. MBS was saying that informal was no longer enough. Saudi Arabia also demanded American support for a Saudi civilian nuclear program, the right to enrich uranium on Saudi soil and to develop the full nuclear fuel cycle, rights the United States had denied other regional partners. MBS had said publicly that if Iran developed nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia would pursue nuclear capability. The demand for enrichment rights was the formal operationalization of that stated position. Washington looked at those demands and saw an extraordinary problem. Netanyahu's right-wing coalition had no political capacity to deliver meaningful Palestinian statehood concessions. The forces most opposed to Palestinian statehood were precisely the forces providing his governing majority. Delivering what MBS demanded would require Netanyahu to break his coalition or call new elections. Neither was politically available. MBS had constructed a demand set that Israel could not satisfy on its own, that America could satisfy only at significant political cost, and that therefore kept Saudi Arabia in the position of the indispensable partner, whose terms were being negotiated. Previous Arab-Israeli normalization processes had always been framed as Arab states accepting the reality of Israeli existence in exchange for whatever Israel and America offered. MBS flipped that framing entirely. Saudi normalization was the prize. Israel and America were competing to meet the conditions for receiving it. The prize holder was Riyadh. The competitors were Jerusalem and Washington, the four decisions that built the leverage architecture. The strategic outcome did not emerge from natural circumstances. It was engineered through four deliberate decisions that compounded in their effect. Decision 1 was holding back from the Abraham Accords, patience deployed as a weapon. Every Arab state that normalized without Riyadh increased the scarcity and therefore the value of Saudi recognition. Decision 2 was structuring demands as real requirements, not opening bids. The Palestinian statehood demand was not a symbolic position designed to be traded away. The defense treaty demand was not an opening bid to be settled for informal assurances. This prevented Israel and America from treating the process as standard diplomatic negotiation where patient compromise eventually produces an acceptable outcome. MBS's structure left no compromise available, only meeting the actual price. Decision 3 was the parallel development of alternatives. The China relationship deepened. The Iran normalization was brokered by Beijing in 2023. OPEC Plus production decisions demonstrated Saudi economic autonomy. Each move reduced the visible urgency of Saudi need for American and Israeli goodwill. Less desperate means more patient. More patient means better terms. Decision 4 was the management of domestic opinion through Vision 2030. Young Saudis who attended international concerts, watched global sports events in Riyadh, and built economic aspirations around Vision 2030 were a different political constituency than the Saudi public of a generation earlier. This gave MBS more room to maneuver on normalization than any previous Saudi king had possessed. None of these four decisions was a single masterstroke in isolation. Together, they constituted a strategic architecture that produced the outcome where Israel was negotiating on Saudi terms. The geography of power in the Middle East was quietly, systematically rewritten. October 7th, disruption and paradox. By 2023, normalization negotiations were progressing. A framework appeared to be within reach. The strategic logic was driving both sides toward the brink of a deal. Then came October 7th. The Hamas attack and the subsequent Israeli military response in Gaza suspended the normalization negotiations entirely. Images from Gaza saturated Arab media for months. The Palestinian street that had been demobilized was remobilized. The generational shift in Arab public opinion that had made normalization politically possible was reversed, at least temporarily. The Gaza war exposed a real vulnerability in MBS's architecture. The Palestinian political reality had more resilience than calculated. The assumption that Palestine had lost its emotional grip on Arab societies proved incorrect. The grip had weakened, it had not disappeared. The scale and visibility of the suffering in Gaza reactivated political constraints that MBS had been carefully managing toward irrelevance. The domestic political insulation built through Vision 2030 had limits, but the suspension of the normalization timeline did not eliminate the underlying strategic reality. Saudi Arabia still held the prize. Israel still wanted it. America still needed it. The war changed the conditions, not the fundamental leverage position. The war that disrupted the normalization timeline may paradoxically have strengthened his negotiating position. The Gaza war gave MBS additional domestic political cover for demanding concrete Palestinian outcomes as the price of Saudi recognition. Palestinian concessions were no longer bargaining chips to be negotiated down. They were genuine requirements reflecting real political constraints in Riyadh. When normalization eventually resumes, it will resume on terms at least as favorable to Saudi Arabia as before October 2023, possibly more favorable. The nuclear dimension. Iran's nuclear program was the one genuine security dependency that limited MBS's freedom of action, even as he exercised it in every other domain. Saudi Arabia's existential concern about Iranian nuclear capability produced the alignment with American policy that kept Riyadh inside the Western orbit. The demand for enrichment rights was MBS's attempt to resolve that dependency. If America was going to permit Iran to retain nuclear infrastructure as part of any diplomatic settlement, Saudi Arabia was not going to accept a permanently inferior position in the regional nuclear balance. The demand was not primarily about enriching uranium in the near term. It was about securing the legal and technical foundation for a capability Saudi Arabia could develop if the regional nuclear balance shifted in ways that American deterrence alone could not manage. A Saudi enrichment program creates proliferation risks that American policy has spent decades preventing. But denying enrichment rights means potentially losing the normalization prize that the entire Abraham Accords framework was designed to culminate in. There is no clean resolution to that tension. Every option costs something important. MBS designed the demand precisely because he understood the tension was real, and that being the cause of it gave him leverage no previous Saudi leader had possessed. The nuclear negotiation remains unresolved. The normalization itself remains unresolved. The full shape of what MBS eventually extracts will only be known when the deal is finally done. What nobody saw coming and why. Western analysts who predicted his isolation after Khashoggi did not see it coming. Israeli strategists who assumed Saudi recognition would arrive on terms consistent with previous Arab normalizations did not see it coming. American diplomats who thought they were managing a familiar confidence-building process did not see it coming. MBS saw it coming because he designed it. The masterstroke was already in motion before most observers understood what kind of game was being played. By the time they understood, the board was already set in his favor. This is not a small thing. It is not a temporary fluctuation in regional politics. It is a structural transformation that took decades to become possible and one determined leader to execute. The board is set. Saudi Arabia is setting the terms. Israel and America are competing to meet those terms. The price includes a defense treaty, enrichment rights, and Palestinian concessions that go beyond anything previously delivered. That architecture is MBS's creation, built through patience, through alternatives, through domestic consolidation, through the discipline to hold the most valuable card in the deck rather than play it at the first opportunity. Israel wanted Saudi normalization more than Saudi Arabia needed to give it. That asymmetry of desire was the foundation of MBS's leverage, and he used it with a patience and a precision that produced a diplomatic situation in which the most militarily powerful state in the region was negotiating on terms set by the state it had spent decades treating as a strategic partner it did not need to formally acknowledge. Israel came to Riyadh with its best offer. MBS said not enough. And in that refusal is the entire story of how the Middle East's power geometry shifted, who engineered the shift, and why the region that emerges from the current period of maximum turbulence will be organized around terms that a Saudi crown prince wrote before anyone else knew the terms were being written. The masterstroke nobody saw coming is still playing out. The final move has not been made. The player holding all the important cards is sitting in Riyadh, and he is not in a hurry. The world will remember this period as the moment the Middle East stopped being organized around American preferences and started being organized around Saudi ones. The next chapter of Middle Eastern history begins not in Washington or Jerusalem, but in Riyadh.